Andrew Lowell didn't move to the hills outside of Oakfield to make friends. He didn't come to barbecue, wave to neighbors, or sign up for block parties. He came because the city had drained him dry. Not financially, no, his business had been running steady for years, but mentally. He distributed industrial cleaning supplies, a thankless, invisible field where everything ran on logistics, not smiles. Oakfield seemed like a place where the system still worked. Quiet, clean, rules on paper. That's what drew him. He found the house by accident. A sturdy, single-level property perched on a slight slope with an overgrown garden and one warped fence. Nothing glamorous, just honest square footage, space between walls, and no footsteps above or below. The previous owner had died. The family needed it off their hands. Andrew signed the papers in under a week. From the start, something about the neighborhood didn't sit right. Not in an obvious way. The streets were clean, sure, lawns edged with robotic precision. But it was the silence that stuck with him, the kind that wasn't peaceful, but loaded, like everyone was listening through walls. The first 3 days passed without incident. He installed a basic exterior light over the driveway and had a team clear the gutters. His only real interaction was with a delivery man who asked him where Unit 12B was. Andrew didn't know. He didn't care. He wasn't there to give directions. On the 4th day, a woman rang his doorbell. That's how she introduced herself to his world. No warning, no welcome, no subtle approach. She stood in a floral robe with fuzzy sandals and an oversized iced coffee sloshing in her hand like it was an extension of her wrist. Her hair was done up in pink curlers, and despite the early hour, her foundation glowed under the porch light. Her smile never touched her eyes. She didn't introduce herself by name, not at first, just walked 2 steps too close, peered behind him like she was inspecting a hotel room she'd been assigned to by mistake, and said, "I saw you installed a camera." No, hello, no pleasantries. Her voice had that sourness people used when they'd already made up their minds. Andrew kept the doorframe between them, instinctively. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "It faces the driveway." "It catches part of my porch," she said, her tone sharp as vinegar. "That's not legal in this state." Andrew didn't move. "It's motion activated, faces my vehicle, doesn't record sound. It's well within code." He'd researched it thoroughly, knowing full well what kind of environment he was entering. "You're not being surveilled." "I feel surveilled," she said, stepping back, arms crossed under the swell of her chest, her chin lifted like a stubborn child daring someone to disagree. "I have sensitive health issues. Your lens sees my front step. That's my boundary. You don't need to see my boundary." That was when she said her name. Karen Randolph. She stressed it like it was a position. Not just a name, but a rank. Then she looked him over, top to bottom, not hiding her contempt. "You're not from here, are you?" Andrew only nodded once. She squinted, stepped back, and said, "I'll be submitting a concern." That word, concern, hung in the air like a gnat. She didn't mean complaint, and she didn't mean issue. She meant leverage. He closed the door without saying another word. The following night, at precisely 2:14 a.m., Andrew's motion alert chimed once, then twice, then 3 times in quick succession. He was awake, still trying to make the place feel like home, sorting through wiring diagrams and supplier calls on his laptop. The alert startled him. Not because of what it was, but because of the silence that followed. He accessed the footage. The camera had caught the glow of a porch light flipping on across the street. Then, a silhouette. Someone heavy-set, fast-moving, holding what looked like a long object. The figure was walking straight toward the camera, their head down. A bright flash caught in the lens. Metal. The next moment, static. Then black. Andrew went outside, flashlight in hand, jaw tight. The camera was dangling by one wire twisted backward, the lens cracked. It had been struck, not once, but several times. Beneath the wall mount was a trail of flattened plants and a single muddy boot print. He followed it to the street, but it vanished at the curb. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He wasn't that kind of man. But he did take the camera down, cleaned the cracked surface, and wrapped it in a towel. He left it on his kitchen counter overnight. In the morning, he walked across the street and calmly, deliberately wedged the camera into the narrow opening of Karen's oversized black mailbox. Not tossed, placed. The wire still hung from it like a tail. He didn't leave a note. He didn't ring the bell. He didn't need to. Message delivered. By noon, 2 officers were at his door. Andrew wasn't rattled. He opened with a firm nod and they explained they were responding to a property damage complaint. Karen had reported vandalism with hostile intent. They said it in a tone that implied they didn't believe it, but they were obligated to check. He invited them in, showed them the footage, showed them the timestamp, the damage. They watched in silence. One of them leaned back and scratched the back of his head. That looks like a shovel. Andrew shrugged. Looks like it. Why didn't you report it? I'm reporting it now, Andrew said simply. Because you're here. Karen had left out her part of the story, of course, but the footage spoke louder than her claims. The officers filed a report, asked if he wanted to press charges. He said no. Not yet. One of them asked if he had a backup system installed. He didn't answer. Later that night, Andrew sat on the back steps of his house, watching the shadows stretch long over his new fence. The property was quiet again, the silence back, but now it felt different. It wasn't the kind of quiet that promised peace. It was the kind that held its breath, the kind that watched. Somewhere behind one of those blackout curtains across the street, he knew she was staring, waiting to see what he'd do next. Waiting to see if he'd cave or escalate. This wasn't about a camera. This was about territory, about posture, about the game. Andrew finished his coffee and went inside, locking the door behind him. Not because he was scared, because now he knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen didn't retaliate immediately. That's what struck Andrew as odd. For 3 full days after the police visit, her porch remained eerily still. No movement behind the blinds, no scolding voice echoing across the lawn about noise, boundaries, or how things were done around here. It was as if she'd vanished, or worse, was waiting. Andrew kept his head down, business as usual. He worked remotely when he could, drove into town when he had to, nodded politely at the few neighbors who made eye contact, but otherwise lived as he always had, quietly, methodically, intentionally. Still, the tension that had settled over the street was undeniable. You didn't need raised voices to know when you were being watched. All it took was the slight shift of blinds when he opened his garage door, or the fact that the same white SUV with a cracked passenger mirror had parked opposite his house 3 times that week without a single occupant stepping out. At first, Andrew thought he was imagining things. Then came the trash incident. It was a Thursday morning, the kind where the sky looked like it couldn't decide whether to rain or just hang low in gray indecision. Andrew stepped outside to bring in the bins and stopped cold on the front step. His recycling bin had been overturned. The contents, a predictable mix of delivery packaging, plastic wrap, and 2 empty wine bottles, spilled across his driveway like an accusation. Someone had gone through it, not just knocked it over, but picked through it. The garbage had been scattered deliberately, certain pieces laid out flat, others stacked like a child had tried to build a house of soggy cards and given up halfway. His regular bin had a long, purposeful slice down the side, the cut too clean to be from weather or animals. It had been done with a blade. He didn't say anything. He just cleaned it up. Not because it didn't matter, but because responding now would give it power. but he knew it was her. There was no proof, no direct evidence, but the rhythm of it all, the provocation, the silence, the waiting, was unmistakable. Karen had traded overt confrontation for low-level psychological warfare. Andrew checked his new floodlight camera system. It had been installed just a few days prior, carefully placed beneath the roofline and camouflaged into the existing architecture. He pulled up the feed from the previous night and watched. There. 3:42 a.m. A figure again. This time, not Karen. At least, not clearly. The person wore a large coat with the hood drawn tight, shoulders hunched, gait exaggerated. The camera caught only seconds before the figure ducked behind the front hedge. The image wasn't clear enough to make an ID, but Andrew saw what they had in their hand. A long, flat-bladed object. Could have been a scraper. Could have been a knife. Later that day, Andrew called the non-emergency line for the local department, spoke briefly with a female dispatcher who sounded equal parts distracted and skeptical. He described the trespassing, the damage to his bin, the footage. She asked if anything had been stolen. He said no. She asked if he recognized the person. He said no. Then she asked the question that hung in the air like a slap. "Do you feel threatened?" Andrew hesitated, then said, "I feel provoked." The line was quiet for a second. Then she told him to file an incident report online and keep the footage in case. It happened again. He did. And then he waited. That weekend, it escalated. Andrew had gone out to grab supplies, standard yard tools, a few motion sensor replacements, and industrial-strength adhesive strips for mounting cameras without drilling. He'd only been gone 2 hours. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw her. Karen was standing on his lawn. Not the sidewalk, not the curb. His lawn. She wore the same floral robe from their first encounter, now stained near the hem, and held a garden rake in one hand, not slung casually but tight in her grip like a protest sign. Her other hand rested on her hip. Behind her, a thin teenage boy sat cross-legged on the curb, earphones in, oblivious. Andrew stepped out of the car and said nothing. She didn't wait for him to speak. "You have a problem with your lighting," she said loudly, gesturing with the rake to his eaves. "It's been flashing on and off at night. That's harassment." Andrew didn't move. "The motion light?" he asked. "It's too bright. It's pointed at my house." Andrew stayed silent for a moment, then stepped around to the back of the car and began unloading. She didn't like that. She took a step closer. "And you think it's appropriate to install surveillance equipment that records children?" she said louder. "There's a minor who walks this sidewalk. I checked. This is now a safety issue." Andrew dropped the tool bag harder than necessary. "I've already gone over this," he said, voice steady but pointed. "The footage is on a closed loop. It's not publicly accessible. I've reported the vandalism and the trespassing." Karen narrowed her eyes. "So you're going to be difficult." Andrew locked eyes with her. "I'm going to be legal." The moment hung thick between them, the air sticky and tense. Then she turned sharply and walked back across the lawn, dragging the rake behind her like a wounded limb. Andrew watched her until she vanished into her house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle a wind chime. That night, it crossed a line. At 4:11 a.m., a sharp, metallic thud jolted Andrew awake. It wasn't a car door, it wasn't wind, it was something striking the house, hard. He rolled out of bed, grabbed his flashlight and went to the front door. The floodlight didn't trigger. He stepped out barefoot, scanning the area. Then he saw it. The front-facing camera had been ripped from the wall. Not broken, not smashed, torn. Wires dangled like nerves from the siding. There were deep gouges in the trim, and the brick wall below had a fresh dent, almost like someone had swung a tool and missed. He didn't speak. He didn't mutter curses. He simply went back inside, turned on the hallway light, and called his lawyer. Not the police. Not this time. The man's name was Carrick. a private legal counsel he used for business disputes but whose skill set extended further. Andrew left a message outlining the situation, the footage, the repeated incidents, and the increasingly aggressive behavior. He ended the call with a single sentence: "We need to document everything." By the time the sun rose, Andrew had already made 3 phone calls. One to his security system vendor requesting a remote forensic review, one to his property insurance provider initiating a claim, and one to the city's code enforcement division requesting a site inspection, not for Karen, but for himself. If anyone tried to say he was violating property regulations, he wanted documentation ready. His house, his equipment, his wiring, all of it was going on record. What Andrew didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that this wasn't the worst of it, because Karen had already made her next move. The following week unraveled with the subtlety of a wire pulled from a live socket. Nothing exploded, but everything hummed with tension. Andrew had learned early in life that escalation often arrived in increments, not firestorms. It began with the small shifts. Neighbors who once offered distant nods now lowered their eyes or disappeared behind closing doors. The elderly man who used to wave from his driveway now turned his back when Andrew's car passed. Packages that once sat neatly stacked by his porch now arrived crumpled, tossed just far enough to land in puddles. Someone began clipping the edge of his grass, just a few inches inconsistently, as if to blur the boundary between his property and theirs. The code enforcement officer arrived on Tuesday. She was polite, efficient, clipboard in hand, not accusatory but methodical in that practiced bureaucratic way that said, "I'm not here to judge, but I do have to write something down." She inspected the mounting points of Andrew's exterior fixtures, examined the angle of his cameras, measured the placement of his motion lights, and checked for electrical compliance. At the end of the visit, she nodded once, scribbled her final notes, and offered a neutral conclusion. "Everything appears compliant. No violations found." Andrew thanked her, gave her a copy of the damage reports and the timestamps of the vandalism, then asked if there had been other complaints filed, specifically about him. She hesitated only a second too long before answering. "We don't disclose that information, sir." That was confirmation enough. Someone was working behind closed doors to paint a picture of him as the neighborhood problem. He didn't have to guess who. 2 days later, the letter arrived. Not an official citation or a legal document. No, that would have been too direct. Instead, it was a community note, printed on stationery with a smiley tree logo, signed in soft ink by the neighborhood council. The tone was disarmingly gentle, almost condescending in its warmth. "Dear Mr. Lowell, we've received word that there have been concerns about the use of surveillance and light pollution at your property. While we respect all residents' rights to security, we do encourage sensitivity to shared space aesthetics and the comfort of your fellow neighbors. If you'd like to attend our next open forum, we'd love to hear your side and promote mutual understanding." Andrew read it 3 times before folding it and placing it neatly in the shredder. He had no interest in forums. He knew what that meant. Karen was using the council, or whatever this informal collective was, to build a paper trail. First came the warnings, then the formal allegations. The smiley tree would be smiling all the way to litigation. That night, his floodlight went out. Not flickered, went dark. He checked the breaker panel. All fine. He checked the wiring. Severed. Clean cut, inside the conduit pipe, near the base where it met the wall. Someone had come onto his property again, this time with tools and not for noise or mischief. This was surgical. He replaced the wire himself, staying up until 2 in the morning, working with a headlamp and gloves, not because he had to, but because he refused to let someone else dictate when his home would fall into darkness. At 4 a.m., he stood outside in the crisp air, watching the reconnected light hum to life and wash the lawn in cold white glow. Somewhere, behind drawn blinds, he knew she was awake too. Watching. Waiting. He started noticing patterns. Karen no longer approached directly, but her presence hung in the air like mildew. Every time Andrew stepped out, a nearby sprinkler system would suddenly activate, soaking the edge of his walkway. Her trash bins were now stored conspicuously close to his driveway, even though her collection zone was 20 feet in the other direction. He once found a trail of cat litter leading from her curb to his steps. Then came the dog. Not hers, presumably. A large shepherd mix that began showing up in the early mornings, barking at his windows marking the garden, digging at the base of his porch steps. No tags, no collar. He reported it to animal control, filed 2 incident reports, but the dog vanished before officers arrived each time. On the 3rd visit, one of the officers confided, "We think someone's releasing it temporarily." You didn't hear that from me. The tension reached a breaking point on a Saturday morning, when Andrew discovered someone had left a note taped to his front window, hidden under the morning dew. It wasn't written in pen, but burned, carefully etched with heat into a thin strip of wood like an old branding stick. The message was short, but it chilled him more than threats ever could. "You see too much." That was it. No name, no symbol, no demand. Just implication. He handed the strip to Carrick, his attorney, who instructed him to begin recording everything. Not just footage, but time-stamped logs, maintenance receipts, mail, garbage, anything unusual. Carrick also quietly filed a preliminary nuisance report to the local magistrate. A legal positioning move that wouldn't go public unless activated by further escalation. The message was clear. We're not retaliating, but we are documenting. Thoroughly. That same week, Andrew received a citation from the municipal zoning office. Not for his cameras or lights, but for exterior architectural inconsistency. Specifically, a newly installed vent fan on the east wall of his garage. He hadn't installed one. He checked. There was no fan. But the citation included a photo. Grainy, but clear enough. A vent cover had been mounted to his garage facing the Randolph property. Except it wasn't functional. It wasn't wired to anything. Someone had installed a dummy fixture on his wall and then reported it. It had to have been Karen. Who else would have the audacity to trespass and stage a violation, just to trigger bureaucracy against him? Andrew removed the false fixture that night and submitted a rebuttal with photo evidence. Still, the warning stayed on record. Another mark on the ledger. Carrick advised him to stay calm, to avoid direct confrontation, to let the record build. "This isn't a sprint," he said. "This is erosion warfare. She's not trying to win. She's trying to exhaust you." Andrew didn't reply. He simply nodded, then installed 2 new cameras, this time embedded into the fascia board of the roofline, with dedicated battery backups and uplink to a private cloud server outside his home network. He wasn't just watching now. He was archiving. The final moment of that week, the one that drew the invisible line between provocation and real danger, came on a Sunday evening as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Andrew stepped out to check the mail and found the box hanging open, its metal door warped. Inside wasn't mail. Inside was a Ziploc bag of soil, a dead battery, and a scorched wire. It didn't make sense. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't even clearly threatening. But it was deliberate. Someone wanted him confused, off balance, guessing. He brought the items inside, photographed them, stored them in a labeled envelope, and marked the time on his growing spreadsheet of incidents. That night, he walked through his house slowly, checking the locks, testing the lights, running his hand along the banister like it was a grounding wire. He didn't feel afraid. He felt measured, watched. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about wearing him down until he either snapped or packed up and left. But he wasn't leaving. He didn't run from pressure. He made a living managing pressure. And now, someone had decided to turn that into a game. Andrew Lowell wasn't a man who played games. He was a man who remembered. By the time the second month passed, Andrew had memorized the exact creak in the floor near his front window and the subtle way the streetlights flickered, not from malfunction, but from a power cycle built into the county's aging infrastructure. He'd begun noticing details that didn't used to register. Footprints on the edge of his gravel walk, shifts in wind patterns that didn't match the weather reports, and the faint hum of an outdoor AC unit that only seemed to activate when he stepped onto his porch. His world had narrowed into a hyper-focused landscape of surveillance, documentation, and response. Not because he was paranoid, but because it was warranted. Something was happening, and it was happening with precision. It was no longer about petty vandalism or neighborly tension. It was methodical, intentional, and possibly coordinated. One morning, a call came from the private security company Andrew had hired to perform a forensic review of his system logs. The technician, a young man named Blake who spoke in a clipped, neutral tone, said he had found abnormal packet behavior in the uplink logs from one of the older cameras. Andrew didn't pretend to understand the technical jargon, but the summary was clear. Someone had pinged the camera from an external IP address at 4:03 a.m. 3 nights ago, using a spoofed identity tag meant to look like his own router. In short, someone had tried to hijack the feed, not disable it, but mirror it. Whoever they were, they wanted to see what Andrew's cameras saw. That was a new layer of escalation. This wasn't just harassment, it was data extraction. Surveillance of the surveillance. Blake recommended a complete hardware reset and firmware update, along with a hardline firewall box between the router and the house's internal grid. Andrew agreed immediately. When he asked if this kind of breach was common, Blake hesitated, then said, "Not unless someone really wants to know what you're seeing." That line stayed with him. It echoed louder than the late-night noises, louder than Karen's snide remarks or the odd rearrangements of his trash bins. Someone wanted to see what he was watching. That meant someone was trying to manage the narrative from the other side. Andrew began to suspect he wasn't Karen's only target. One evening, under the guise of checking his side fence, he struck up a slow, cautious conversation with a neighbor 2 doors down. A man named Joseph, retired, well-kept, who mostly kept to his garden and classical music in the afternoons. When Andrew mentioned Karen's name, Joseph froze for just a second, then laughed. But it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was tired, resigned. "Let me guess," Joseph said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Cameras, lights, sudden complaints about the shape of your mailbox?" Andrew didn't answer. He didn't need to. Joseph continued, quieter now. "She tried it with me, too. Said my backyard shed was an eyesore. Filed a complaint claiming it was zoning non-compliant, even though I'd had it for 12 years. I fixed it, painted it, didn't matter, still got a fine. But I've lived here long enough to know when someone's trying to push you off the board." That phrasing stuck. Push you off the board. It was how Karen operated. Not to win, to isolate, to crowd out. The next day, Andrew received an envelope not in the mail, but slid under his garage door. Inside was a single page. No letterhead, no signature. Just a printout from a real estate listing website. His own house. Listed as under market consideration, with a digital watermark that looked like it had been added in Photoshop. It wasn't real, but it was designed to look real. The listing showed outdated photos. Images from before he moved in. The details were all wrong, square footage off, property taxes incorrect. But the implication was clear. Someone wanted to stir unease, plant the seed that perhaps he wasn't in full control of what happened on his land. Andrew didn't respond. He simply archived the paper with the rest of his case documents and logged the time, the placement, the texture of the paper, even the crease pattern from where it had been folded. Every detail mattered now. That evening, Carrick called with a quiet urgency Andrew hadn't heard in weeks. "I reached out to a friend," he said, "someone who used to sit on the municipal oversight board. Turns out a number of nuisance filings have come through in the past 3 months, all from your block. Half of them anonymous, but they all follow the same pattern. Light complaints, sound complaints, ambiguous safety concerns. Enough to trigger reviews, but vague enough to avoid liability. Andrew leaned against the kitchen counter, listening without interrupting. Carrick went on. I also pulled property records. Your neighbor, Karen, has submitted 6 public information requests this year, 3 of them directly related to your lot, including a map overlay of easements and utility access. Andrew didn't blink. She's trying to find something, Carrick added, some loophole, some hook she can use to force a review or justify a complaint that will stick. Andrew replied with the only thing he had left, then let her keep looking. That night he stayed up, watching the feed from the new rooftop cameras, sipping bitter coffee and staring into the grainy gray of black and white infrared. He didn't feel fear anymore. What he felt was pressure. Controlled, cold, familiar pressure, like the tension before a courtroom verdict or the way the air changes before a summer storm. Something was coming. He didn't know when, and he didn't know how, but the board was shifting beneath his feet. And Karen wasn't playing alone anymore. The first real crack in the silence came not from Karen, not directly, but from the slow, deliberate murmur of authority. It began with a letter. Thick, formal, embossed with a seal that hadn't been used before in this entire ordeal. The envelope bore Andrew's name in capital letters and no return address. But the moment he opened it, the language spoke louder than the paper. It was an official notification from the County Development and Zoning Review Office. According to their records, a petition had been submitted for a preliminary review of perimeter structure noncompliance and external equipment violations on his property. The language was vague enough to be bureaucratic, but precise enough to be dangerous. It wasn't a fine. Not yet. But it was the first nudge toward review, a process that, if it proceeded, could force him into inspections, permit checks, even hearings. And someone had triggered it, someone who knew exactly how to wield pressure like a scalpel. Andrew didn't need to wonder who. He immediately forwarded the document to Carrick, who responded in under an hour with 2 critical observations. First, that the document had been submitted by an anonymous party citing neighboring impact concerns. And second, that the timing coincided almost perfectly with Karen's last reported public records request. The correlation wasn't proof, but in Andrew's mind, it didn't need to be. This was part of her playbook. Flood the system with enough paperwork, and eventually the system would start to lean in your direction out of sheer procedural gravity. Within 48 hours, 2 more letters arrived. One from the tax assessor's office, notifying him of an upcoming visit to verify property characteristics in light of potential improvement declarations, and the second, more quietly sinister, from the Public Utilities Commission. That one stated that routine maintenance of underground utility rights-of-way would require access to the easement behind his fence line. It was the same easement Karen had requested information about months prior. Someone had activated the mechanism. Someone was trying to force their way onto his land, not through aggression, but through clerical erosion. Andrew didn't panic. He planned. He pulled out the boundary surveys, the title, the easement agreements. He arranged for a licensed surveyor to walk the perimeter again and document any recent changes. He began compiling a new file, thick, orderly, irrefutable. For every complaint lodged, he'd have 2 documents in response. He even went so far as to request an independent third-party inspection of his home's exterior installations, knowing full well that Karen, or someone working with her, might attempt to claim code violations down the line. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was building armor. But as the paper battle raged, the physical pressure tightened. His side fence, once sturdy and aligned flush with the landscaping, began to shift. Not dramatically, just by inches, small enough to be dismissible, but consistent. He thought at first it might be soil erosion or structural fatigue, but when he dug at the base, he found the bolts at the corner anchor had been loosened. Not rusted, not worn, but physically unscrewed. One was missing entirely. Someone had entered his yard and tampered with the fence. It didn't collapse, but it groaned in the wind now, vulnerable, like a signal. He replaced the bolts, reinforced the post, and left a motion-sensitive camera hidden inside the lattice paneling, facing outward just in case. He didn't sleep well that night or the next. He kept waking at the same time, 3:41 a.m., feeling like something was moving outside the window, something just beyond the edge of the light. Then came the formal complaint, a registered letter, signed, time-stamped, and stamped with an official complaint number. It accused Andrew of operating unauthorized electronic surveillance equipment capable of infringing on the reasonable expectation of privacy of adjacent properties. The complaint cited no direct evidence, but it referenced ongoing resident concerns, photographic documentation, and statements made during an open forum. There had been no open forum, not one Andrew was invited to anyway. But now it was real. This wasn't just nuisance, this was a legal step. It triggered a municipal review and required a formal response from Andrew within 10 business days. Carrick was furious, but calm. "This is her endgame," he said during their call. "She's testing whether you'll bite, whether you'll settle, back down, withdraw. The moment you concede 1 inch, she'll use it to justify the next escalation. The only answer is pressure. We respond thoroughly, we respond with documentation, and we request a cross-investigation into retaliatory action." Andrew didn't argue. He'd already started the draft. Every camera model, every angle, every field of view had been mapped and measured. He'd preemptively filed declarations from 2 other residents who confirmed that Andrew's cameras faced only his own property and the shared public road. But Karen wasn't done. The next event didn't arrive by mail. It arrived as sound, a screech, a groan, a crash. At 6:14 a.m., Andrew's motion alert went off, but it wasn't from a person. A delivery van had mounted the curb and clipped the corner of his front yard, ripping through a set of decorative stones and sending a shower of gravel across the walkway. When Andrew confronted the driver, the man, shaken and pale, apologized profusely and explained that his GPS had shifted and told him to turn early. When Andrew checked the app's GPS overlay later that day, the road data had been altered. Just slightly, a misplaced pin, a mislabel, but enough to cause confusion. Was it coincidence? Was it carelessness? Or was someone feeding bad information into a routing system that could be manipulated? Andrew logged the incident, filed the footage, and contacted the delivery service. They promised to cover the landscaping costs. But the damage was symbolic. His perimeter, his buffer, wasn't safe anymore. It wasn't even physical. It had been abstracted into data, schedules, documents, and maps, and that's what made it harder to fight. You couldn't punch paperwork. You couldn't confront silence. You could only endure it until you found the breach point. A week later, the breach came, just not where Andrew expected. It came in the form of a knock on the door. Not a package, not a stranger, but Joseph, his quiet neighbor, the one with the classical music and the weary laugh. The man held an envelope in one hand and a tired expression on his face. "I wasn't going to get involved," he said, "but she's dragging us in whether we like it or not." Inside the envelope were photocopies, emails, handwritten notes, annotated maps. Nothing overtly illegal, but clear signs that Karen had been soliciting complaints, even drafting statements for neighbors to submit under their names. "She asked me to say your lights gave my wife migraines," Joseph said, his voice low. "My wife's been dead for 3 years. Andrew didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just nodded, took the envelope and added it to the growing war chest of quiet evidence. This wasn't about personalities anymore. It was about territory, about dominion, and Karen had crossed the line from difficult neighbor to active threat. That night, Andrew sat alone in his living room staring at the blank wall where the television used to be before he boxed it up. Too many nights of silence had made it feel like noise. The room was still, filled with shadows that moved only when he blinked. He didn't feel fear. He felt momentum. Karen had declared war in whispers and paper, in half-truths and strategic omissions. But war was war all the same. And now it was Andrew's move. The real shift didn't come with a letter or knock. It came with silence. But not the ordinary kind. Not the cold void that had hovered between Andrew and his neighbors since the first camera went up. This was different. This was the silence of retreat. For 2 full days, nothing happened. No noise from Karen's porch. No stray dog scratching at the garden. No flickers of light at odd hours. It should have felt like a break, a lull, maybe even a win. But it didn't. It felt like tension pulled back on a wire, waiting to snap. Andrew's system showed no motion alerts for 48 hours. That had never happened. No vehicle passes. No figures on the edge of the curb. No phantom shadows tripping infrared sensors. The street looked abandoned, like a film set between takes. And in that stillness, Andrew knew something was coming. It happened at 3:06 in the morning on a Thursday. A dry gust of wind had just passed over the hill, rattling the edge of his hedges, when the exterior camera facing the alleyway caught a figure in motion. Rapid, precise, dressed head to toe in dark fabric. Not Karen. Too tall. Too fluid. The person didn't linger. They crouched by the side panel of his electric meter, fiddled with something, and then disappeared just as fast, vanishing into the blind spot between 2 property lines. The power didn't cut, but something changed. A system ping flashed on his dashboard. Auxiliary input interference detected. Andrew didn't wait. He threw on his clothes, stepped outside with his phone recording in hand, not for drama, but for legal insurance, and made his way around the side yard. The tampering was surgical. The lockbox had been popped, but nothing had been broken. It was a swap. A cable removed and replaced, cleanly. A tiny black object had been clipped inside the meter housing. A signal booster, maybe. Andrew didn't recognize the make, but it was deliberate. Not sabotage. Surveillance. Someone was collecting data again. His data, from his equipment on his property. That was the final trigger. No more warnings. No more second-guessing. By 9:02 a.m., Carrick had filed an emergency injunction with the county to prevent further tampering and to initiate a criminal complaint of trespassing and malicious interference with utility infrastructure. The filing included affidavits, camera footage, third-party analysis from Blake's security audit, and Joseph's earlier testimony. But Andrew didn't stop there. He also requested an independent forensic inspection by a licensed tech analyst unaffiliated with his vendors. The analyst confirmed it the next day. The inserted device was a passive relay, designed to collect network frequencies and reroute them to a separate receiver. Whoever had placed it wasn't just watching. They were building a mirror of Andrew's home system. Every time his camera triggered, they were watching what he watched. For how long, no one could say. Then came the real break. Late that evening, a low, tired knock came from the front door. Not from a stranger, not from Karen, but from the city inspector who had visited weeks earlier during the zoning review. She didn't come to inspect. She came to talk. Off the record. She stood with her clipboard held low, eyes scanning the empty street, and said, "Mr. Lowell, I shouldn't be here, but I can't ignore what I saw this morning." She handed him a folded paper. No seal, no signature, just a printout of a correspondence chain between a property management affiliate and a community member representative. In it, Karen's name was listed alongside a series of requests for targeted documentation strategy and a recommendation for soft enforcement escalation. Language used in real estate code compliance when the goal was to push a resident out by procedural means. "She's trying to force a sale," the inspector said quietly. "Your lot's worth more than she thinks you deserve to have. And someone, possibly more than one, has been helping her stack a file that makes you look like a non-compliant nuisance." Andrew didn't blink. "Is this part of something bigger?" he asked. The inspector hesitated. "I can't answer that, but if I were you, I'd take this seriously. She's not just a neighbor anymore. She's part of a mechanism." It was enough. The next morning, Andrew initiated a formal legal complaint not just against Karen, but against the managing entity of the subdivision for failure to act on multiple reports of targeted harassment, selective enforcement, and coordinated interference. His lawyer served cease-and-desist letters to Karen, the unnamed representative listed in the document, and the affiliate who had processed the zoning push. At the same time, he turned over all surveillance records to the sheriff's department, organized, time-stamped, verified. The detective assigned to the case, a man in his 50s with the calm presence of someone who'd seen one too many property line feuds spiral into violence, called it the most meticulous citizen file he'd ever reviewed. The sheriff's team began interviews the following week. Karen, when approached, was combative, hostile, and refused to answer questions without legal counsel. Her attorney, when contacted, responded not with a denial, but with an attempt to settle. Carrick laughed when he heard. "That means they're nervous. That means we hit something real." Andrew declined the settlement. He wanted something else now. Not revenge, not drama. He wanted accountability. So, when the sheriff's office filed an official notice of investigation into targeted harassment, Karen's expression, caught on one of the last cameras she hadn't tampered with, was one of pure disbelief. She hadn't expected resistance. She hadn't expected someone to out-document her, outlast her, out-cold her. But that's what Andrew did. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten. He watched, he recorded. And when the moment came, he dismantled her strategy the same way she built it. Quietly, with paperwork, and without mercy. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood returned to something resembling quiet, though it was a different quiet than before. No longer heavy with suspicion or simmering aggression, but cautious, careful, as if everyone had realized they'd been standing too close to a fire they hadn't noticed was spreading. Karen's house went dark first, curtains drawn, porch light never on, mailbox taped shut with a handwritten sign that read, "No flyers. No solicitation." Her car stopped appearing in the driveway, and her once daily walks, those slow, deliberate circuits meant to assert presence and authority, vanished. It was the sheriff's second visit that changed things. The one where officers removed 2 evidence boxes from her garage under the cover of a silent afternoon. No sirens, no cuffs, just the cold precision of legal procedure doing what it always eventually does: catch up. The subdivision's management, meanwhile, scrambled. Andrew's lawsuit, though still pending, had exposed enough internal correspondence to warrant external review. A community meeting was hastily scheduled and poorly attended, save for a few pale-faced board members and one intern who couldn't stop glancing at the floor. Carrick had advised Andrew not to speak, and he didn't. He sat in the back row, arms crossed, listening as the words oversight, review process, and individual accountability were repeated like prayers from people who had only just remembered what due process meant. 3 weeks after that, a real estate sign appeared on Karen's lawn. Not the cheap kind printed overnight, but a polished, professional one with a discreet listing agent upon request tab bolted at the bottom. The next day, a moving van showed up, unbranded, driven by a man who didn't make eye contact with anyone. The boxes were already packed. She didn't come outside until the very end, wearing oversized sunglasses and a beige windbreaker, her hair tied back tight, face unreadable. Andrew watched from his porch, not out of vindication, but out of necessity. He needed to see it through. She paused by the mailbox she'd once claimed as her territorial marker, the same one he'd embedded the shattered remains of his camera into. For a second, she looked like she might reach for it, say something, turn back. But she didn't. She climbed into the passenger seat, closed the door, and didn't look at the house again. The van pulled away without sound, and just like that, she was gone. Not erased, not undone, but removed, like a file archived into a cabinet marked irrelevant. The street changed after that. The blinds that once fluttered at his every movement stopped moving. People began to wave again, short, awkward at first, like limbs relearning how to perform basic civility. Joseph brought over a tin of fresh cookies, didn't stay long, didn't say much, but left behind a simple line. "We're glad you stayed." The subdivision management replaced 2 members of the board quietly, almost sheepishly, and revised their enforcement process with an addendum that bore the dry title Resident Engagement and Equity Protocol. Andrew framed his copy and nailed it behind his utility closet, not out of pride, but to remember that words only matter when they're backed by action. He didn't take down his cameras, he didn't scale back his documentation, he didn't relax, but he did sleep, really sleep, for the first time in months, no longer watching his yard through pixelated night vision at 3 in the morning. He kept the final incident log in a box beneath his desk, along with the false listing flyer, the scorched utility wire, and the letter Joseph had given him. Every so often he opened it, not to relive it, but to remind himself what real persistence looks like. Not flashy, not loud, just steady, undeniable pressure applied over time until even the most stubborn opposition either breaks or moves. The house felt like his again. Not a fortress, not a contested zone, but a home. He rebuilt the garden Karen's dog had destroyed, replaced the mailbox with one made of steel, and installed a new light over the porch, brighter, sharper, faster. When it flicked on at dusk, it bathed the steps in clean white certainty, not as a warning, but as a declaration. This place is seen, and it will not be taken. Not again. Not ever.